we'll be able to go from here. So we're picking up today with actually the suicide of Judas Iscariot, but last time Christ came before the Sanhedrin. They condemned him. They had the false witnesses that actually said a couple of different things. They violated so much of their own law in having this trial. They had it at night. Christ didn't have any witnesses in his defense. They changed the charges a couple of times. There's just all kinds of things that they did improperly, if you will. And so before we continue with the account of what happens with Christ in the next not quite full day, overnight and morning, we have an inset of what happens with Judas Iscariot. We obviously already covered the betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane, that he came and pointed out Christ. It's still a bit of an odd thing to consider why he had to do that. That you would think Christ was well enough known, especially to the Sanhedrin, whether it was a matter of being absolutely sure or just to have the pretext that this was a serious enough offense going on they had to address. But anyway, Judas obviously now has something very heavy on his mind. Some have speculated that perhaps Judas didn't anticipate that the Sanhedrin wanted to kill Christ. Now, there were so many opportunities that were recorded that we've already read where they sought to kill him. So you'd think Judas would have a better understanding of this, but maybe he just didn't see it that way. We know he was a thief. We know that he had the money bag. We also can sort of speculate, as others had the same opinion, that perhaps he thought Christ wasn't being strong enough if he was the Messiah, and the misunderstanding that he was coming to replace or reestablish the kingdom of Israel at that time. Maybe he thought this would be sort of the kick that would provide the impetus for Christ to actually do that. But nonetheless, it goes sideways on him, not the way he expected it to go at all. So we'll pick up the account in Matthew 27, verse 3, where it says, "Then Judas, who betrayed him," Christ, "when he saw that Jesus was condemned." So he was another one of those who kind of hung back in the crowd to watch what was playing out. It says he felt remorse, and that's probably a great understatement. It was very disconcerting to him. This is not, again, what he thought was going to happen, it seems. So he brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, "I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? You see to it." And this is another one of these very odd things that the Sanhedrin did. They paid Judas this bribe money, and that was okay. But now that he brings it back and they know that Christ is going to be condemned, it's now blood money they can't accept. So this passive aggressive back and forth that they're doing here. The 30 pieces of silver is very interesting as well. At the current time, it was about half year's salary. So not a small sum. Let's just say the average person in this country makes around 50,000. It's a little less last time I looked, but $25,000 being dropped in your lap, literally. And that's, for a lot of people, that'd be very hard to turn down. But what's also very notable is if you go back to Exodus 21, this is the price of an injured slave. So slaves in Israel were not like slaves in this country and many other countries that have had slavery. It was more indentured servitude. If you owed money to someone you couldn't repay, you went to work for them for whatever length of time based on what you owed them. Now, you also had the Jubilees in there. Later, they didn't have the Jubilees. But once the amount of work was given that satisfied the debt, you could stay on as a servant to that household. But if you were injured through negligence of the property owner, the property owner had to provide compensation. And so this 30 pieces of silver was if the slave, the indentured servant, was injured. So it just kind of some interesting connections there about Christ being injured and the price of a slave, and all of these sort of things that we could elaborate on another time. So he threw down the pieces, verse 5, Matthew 27. He threw the pieces of silver in the sanctuary and departed. Now, this is the entrance of the temple, um, to the temple, I should say. He wanted nothing to do with it. So he's throwing it back where they would have to take it. And it says he went away and he hung himself. This is how depressed he was, how beyond any view of how things could turn out better. And the remorse that is stated in verse 3 just was so deep that the only way he could stop it in his mind, if you will, was to kill himself. So, verse 6, the chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, it's not lawful to put them in the treasury since it is the price of blood, which again, they paid, but this is their justification. So they took counsel, they bought the potter's field with it to bury strangers in. Now, this is outside of Jerusalem, and this field evidently was clay soil primarily, and it was an area where various potters would go out and dig up this clay to use to make the various vessels out of clay that they made. Some historians, theologians think that because there were so many holes in this field where clay was dug out, that it was used then in this manner to bury, we call indigent people, people that had no family that claimed the body. They were so poor, they were from another area, that they couldn't provide for their own burial in their death. So the Sanhedrin uses the money to buy the field so they can bury strangers in it. And so it says, verse 8, that field is called Field of Blood to this day. That expression to this day, sometimes we have to pay attention to the context, because it doesn't mean for henceforth and evermore, even to the 21st century, but it could mean sometimes by the time this was recorded, it was still called that. If we go to Acts 1 and verse 18, it is being referred to there about Judas. And this is the beginning of Acts, is when they're discussing the need for a replacement for Judas as one of the disciples, now apostles. And so the comment is, this man obtained a field with the reward for his wickedness, and falling headlong, his body burst open and all of his intestines gushed out. So we're not told where he hung himself, but there are a couple of scenarios that could play in here. Obviously, he was by himself. He probably chose a remote area. He probably chose a very steep area with a tree overhanging so that, when he dropped, he would die. One possibility is that he miscalculated the weight, and it is possible to literally strip the head off of a body if there's enough force. One scenario is that that could have happened, and if the head was no longer holding the body up with the noose around it, then of course the body would fall, and if it was a rugged area, how far it fell, depending, could also then slice open the body and so forth. So those are possible scenarios there, but the end result is he died. Verse 19, it became known to everyone who lived in Jerusalem in their language. The field was called Akeldama, or the field of blood. So it seems that it was close to this area, wherever this field was, that the Sanhedrin purchased, or maybe just through his death, knowing he had taken this bribe, was used to buy that field, and that he was buried there as well. So that Acts 1 is this inset that gives us a little more information about how he died, after he hung himself, what happened after that. So going back to Matthew 27, verse 9, then, jumped ahead too far. It says, then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. Now there are some various different opinions here. I'm sorry, I lost my screen there. Oops. There we go. Sorry about that. Because there is no direct accounting here of Jeremiah actually recording this in his book. Verse 9 again, Matthew 27, it says, that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him, Christ, the Messiah to come, upon whom the price had been set, whom some of the children of Israel priced, and they gave them for a potter's field as the Lord commanded me. So it's actually Zechariah that recorded it. There are verses in Jeremiah that allude to some of these things. And so one possibility here is that, excuse me, excuse me, Jeremiah is credited with it because in the Hebrew division of the Old Testament, their scriptures, Hebrew scriptures, Jeremiah was the first in the prophetic list of books. And so it could be that they're just referencing the prophetic books, and not that this is a misquoting or something of that nature. So anyway, another one of the prophecies regarding Christ, his life and death, and how that so many of those things were foretold. So that's Judas. And so then the next aspect of picking up the trail, if you will, of Christ in the next 12 or so hours till his death, he's brought before Pilate, and he's brought before Pilate several times. And this is the first time. He's actually at Herod's palace, and there's an interesting thing that I'll come to here in a moment. But because this was a Gentile domain, it was Herod's estate, Pilate was there, the Sanhedrin doesn't actually enter into the building. Now, they could enter into the courtyard, but they couldn't go in the domicile, the home, or the place where business was done, because according to their laws, that would contaminate them, make them unclean ceremonially. They misapplied and took too far some of the aspects of what constituted uncleanness spiritually before God. In their minds, even going into the home of a Gentile made them unclean. So we'll see that they're not in the room with Christ when he's being interviewed by Pilate. But again, at Herod's estate. So let's pick it up in Luke. Luke has the most coverage, if you will, here. I'm sorry, John. Let's do John. So John 18, verse 28 says, they led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas, this is the high priest, to the praetorium. Now, historically, the praetorium was the tent of a Roman general on the battlefield, and this was where business was done. Strategy was done. If there was capitulation, a surrendering of the enemies, it was done there. It was the official place, and it had the standard, the Roman standard outside of it. And the Romans valued those standards as if they were holy. They actually fought wars over losing their standard to the enemy. Over time, that morphed into where the Roman official of whatever area, region, where he resided and or where he did business. Now, Pilate didn't live in Jerusalem. He lived in Caesarea. That was the official capital, if you will, of Roman Palestine. But he had come down to this area, and so to do business, he was in what's called the Praetorium, and this would have been a place of business that was part of Herod's estate, if you will. So if I scroll down a little bit, this is a model. This image is a model of Jerusalem. Over here's the temple. This is the western wall. The corner that you can't see off the image was where the Jews still worship, where they put their prayers between the stones and so forth. This is the backside of Herod's temple. This is the Antonian fortress here, the Roman garrison that was attached in case there was rioting breaking out around the temple area, they could quickly disperse. So southwest of the temple area, this long building here is Herod's palace, and it truly is a palace. I mean, with real estate being scarce in Jerusalem itself, Herod had a huge place. And one end would have been his home, the other end would have been where business was done. So you see this massive courtyard. It could have held thousands of people in it. And this is where they bring Christ. So continuing in John 18, verse 28 says, they brought him to the praetorium. It was early, and they themselves didn't enter into the praetorium, that they might not be defiled. So again, they would have been defiled entering the place of a Gentile and Gentile business. And there wouldn't have been enough time to become ceremonial clean before the Passover. So they would have stayed outside the building, but they could have been in the courtyard. That would not have been considered their dwelling place. So this is the ceremonially uncleanness that's being referred to here as far as being defiled. So because they're only in the courtyard, they're not coming in the building. Verse 29, Pilate therefore went out to them. He sees this crowd. He probably recognized the high priest or some of the leaders. He hears them being agitated. Perhaps they called to him. He comes out and he says, what accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered, and this is them sort of setting the stage, if you will, because they're not directly answering. They said, essentially, we wouldn't bother you normally. But as they say here, if this man weren't an evildoer, we wouldn't have delivered him up to you. We're here only because of the seriousness of what he's done. So in Luke's account, Luke 23 and verse 2, they claim that he is teaching that the Israelites, the Jews, didn't have to pay taxes. And then also that Christ is claiming to be a king above Caesar. So there are three charges here that they end up making. Any one of them would be serious enough for the death penalty if it was true. To forbid paying taxes essentially meant you were rebelling against Rome. You weren't recognizing their authority. You were going to support their government, their military, any of that, and that was treason. That was a serious charge. The other charge that comes later is they bring up what's called seditious agitation, and this would have been rebellion as well, not necessarily tied to the paying of taxes. And again, a very serious charge that they would have put someone to death for these things. So here are the two of the three that they're making here. So to go back to John 18 and verse 31, I'm sorry, verse 32, Pilate, in response to the Sanhedrin, the high priest, and so forth, those with him, making this accusation that he's an evildoer, Pilate responds and says, then take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. So Pilate was a weak leader. And we'll see this as this plays out. He ends up placating the Jews and sacrificing a man that he knows is innocent. But here at this point, he seems to have known enough about who Christ is, even though we'll see later he never saw him before this, went to hear him and so forth. He basically says, look, the problem you have with this man is an internal matter. It's what we would call it's doctrine. You claim he's a heretic, you don't like what he's teaching. That's your problem. That's not Rome's problem. So he says, go judge him yourself. And the Jews respond and say, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. So now they bring the serious accusation. Look, this is not just internal disputes about religious matters. This man has done serious enough things against Rome that he deserves to be put to death. We can't do that. The Jews weren't allowed to exercise capital punishment. They could scourge, they could banish, they could do other things, but they could not kill someone, put someone to death. And so verse 32 of John 18 says, they said this, that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying what kind of death he would die. So we covered this earlier in Matthew 20. And in Matthew 20, Christ is there the last time foretelling his death. The third time he brought this up. And in Matthew 20, verse 19, it says, they shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock. We'll see that take place here shortly. To scourge him, that will follow. And then to crucify him ultimately. And the third day he shall rise again. So that was already fulfilled, but there's even prophecies going back to the Old Testament that speak to his manner of death and humiliation that he would go through. So John 18, verse 33, Pilate therefore entered again to the praetorium. So he goes back into the building, called Jesus, and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? So now he has to do his investigation because they've made the claim that he puts himself above Caesar. The Jews didn't have a king of their own. Herod was king, but Herod was not a Jew. He was an Edomite. Of the nation of Edom. This is why the Jews always kept Herod a bit at arm's length. So Pilate's interviewing Christ here. Is this the case? And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this aspect. Are you the king of the Jews? And Christ answers in John's account saying, do you say this by yourself or did others tell you about me? Is this your question or a question someone else told you to ask? And this is indication here that Pilate didn't really know who Christ was. Again, the Romans generally weren't concerned about the religious matters of the Jews. As long as they didn't riot, as long as they held their anger and did their own thing and paid their taxes, Rome was okay to let them do their internal matters. So Pilate asks this question. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Christ responding simply, so you say, are you the king of the Jews, as you say? It's not a direct affirmation, but it's not a denial either. But again, Pilate had never taken the time, which is a very curious thing. As much as Christ traveled throughout Judea and the lands of Roman Palestine, we'll see that Herod didn't either. They didn't really take this internal matter seriously, if you will. They really didn't pay attention to it. Pilate probably thought he had more important things to do, being the Roman governor, trying to keep the peace. Of course, he did his own things that stirred the pot. We'll come to that here in a little bit. So even so, you would think that he would want to know what's going on in the region just to be aware of things in case they end up presenting a problem to Rome. So continuing in John's account, John 18, verse 35, Pilate then answers. He says, I'm not a Jew, am I? What do I care about your religious matter? Your own nation and chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done? So he's still not convinced here. So Jesus answers, verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. So he's not answering the question probably the way Pilate wanted to hear. Pilate probably wanted a simple yes or no. Are you king of the Jews? Yes. Okay, we take it from there. King of the Jews? No. Now he can go that direction following that. So he's still not sure what's agitated the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, so much they claim he should be put to death. So this is what Christ responds with. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight that I wouldn't be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here, not yet here. So he's answering yes, but a qualified yes. Yes, I'm king, but not yet. And most of Christianity misses this because he's not returned as king yet. He's qualified. He rebuked Satan, the temptations that Satan threw down, the gauntlet, if you will. He was tested that way, certainly lived his life without sin, and then through his death as well, qualified to replace Satan. So he says, yes, but not yet. It's not yet here. Continuing on then in John 18, verse 37, Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? So he still wants a different answer than what Christ is giving him. Christ answers then, you say that I'm a king. For this reason I have been born, and for this reason I have come into the world, that I should testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Now, this is Pilate's famous or infamous response here in verse 38. Pilate then asked him, what is truth? And you can read that a number of different ways. You could read it as sort of snarky. I don't read it that way. I read this as Pilate, this pricked his ears. Because, I mean, we live in a world that's not much different than the Roman world. And if you're rolling along in the realm of politics, the truth is very quick to be sacrificed, depending on what the end result is desired to be. Pilate saw that probably more than anyone else in the area. He probably participated in it at times himself as well. So what is truth? Truth is something that doesn't change, right? Truth in the sciences is even under attack, but it's supposed to be what is undisputable. Engineering, the hard sciences, gravity is there. Stress and compression and engineering is there, whether you like it or not. Chemical reactions are there, whether you like them or not. But even within life, these are the realm of the philosophers, right? There's certain things that are solid, they claim. And so Pilate's asking the question simply, what is truth? But it seems that he already knew there wouldn't really be a response here. So it says, when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews. So he goes out of the building, back into the courtyard, and he said to them, I find no basis for a charge against him. Right? So he has not claimed to be a king replacing Caesar. He has not stated that they shouldn't be paying taxes. And he can even see from the fact that he probably doesn't have any followers with him at this point, that there's nothing about sedition here, this rebellion. He just sees an average Jew standing before him. Before we leave that point about Pilate, we have John 17:17 there, which is a great verse to keep in mind, where Christ himself answered this before he even asked it. John 17, verse 17 says, sanctify them. This is his prayer in the garden to the Father. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. Pilate wouldn't have responded to that even if Christ had said that to him, because he wouldn't have accepted the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, as God's word. This point is repeated in 1 John and Psalms in a couple of places. So Luke is the only other gospel writer that records Pilate's statement about finding no basis to charge this man. So we know from this that Pilate saw that this was not a political issue. This was a religious issue. And again, they left that to the Jews. He wasn't going to get bogged down in their religious differences. So then moving to Matthew's account, in Matthew 27, verse 12, it says, when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. So this is out in the courtyard. They hear Pilate say, I don't see anything worthy of death here. They start raising the roof again. All these accusations, and I can just imagine this cacophony of noise as they all try to outshout each other, trying to get Pilate to change his mind. Verse 13 of Matthew 27, then Pilate said to him, they're evidently standing close enough to each other still at this point. He turns to Christ and says, don't you hear how many things they testify against you? And the reason he says this, it probably impressed Pilate that Christ was simply not engaged. If you're facing a death charge, most people are going to try to say and do whatever they can to get out of the situation. And Christ is doing the opposite. He's barely responding, even to direct questions. And we see it again here in Matthew 27, verse 14. He gave him no answer, not even one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. So Pilate sees that these are trumped up charges, but a little bit probably agitated at Christ that he wasn't willing to defend himself. So Pilate just doesn't see any way out of this at this point. But the Jews will give him an out, at least temporarily here. In Luke's account, Luke 23, verse 5, it says, but they insisted. The chief priests, the Sanhedrin, the crowd that had followed him to the praetorium, they insisted to Pilate, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Judea, beginning from Galilee even to this place. So they go back to the sedition charge. Now, Pilate did not have a good history with the Jews. He had done a number of things to agitate them, to really get them mad. And this is kind of a veiled threat here from the Jews, that if Pilate doesn't respond the way they want him to respond, then they would raise the charges to Rome. And Pilate had already had some run-ins through things that he had done, probably knew he was on a little bit of thin ice, and that his primary responsibility as governor was maintain the peace, collect the taxes, but maintain the peace. So military resources didn't have to be deployed. So he understands this. But then we move to the next section here. This is in the morning, probably around 9 a.m. Or a little earlier. And Luke is the only one that records now Christ moving from Pilate to Herod. It's just across the courtyard, but still he sends Christ on his way, because Luke 23, verse 6, when Pilate heard Galilee mentioned, he asked if the man was a Galilean. And when he found out that he was in Herod's jurisdiction, that Herod's rulership extended to that region, he sent Christ to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem during those days. Oh, so this is not my problem. It should be handled locally. So I'm going to send him to Herod. Probably trying or hoping that Herod would deal with this and he wouldn't have to get involved any further. So Christ goes in before Herod, verse 8. When Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad. Not the response you would think. This man is being accused of crimes worthy of death. But Herod's excited here, it says, for he had wanted to see Christ for a long time. So this is the other account where we know that the rulers of the region had never bothered to go see or hear Christ. It says because he'd heard many things about him. You know, the news about the nation would trickle around, and Christ had made a name, even if most people didn't like him. It says that Herod had hoped to see some miracle done by Christ. I mean, this is why he was excited. He wanted a show. So he questioned Christ with many words, but Christ is just doing the non-response. He gave Herod no answers. So the chief priests and the scribes stood vehemently accusing him. They were pushing the point here that if the civil authorities didn't do what they wanted, they would make problems for them. So Herod, probably to help satisfy some of the anger and agitation he sees in verse 11, with his soldiers, humiliated Christ and mocked him, dressing him in luxurious clothing, and sent him back to Pilate. We're not told specifically what they did here, but we'll read in other places that they struck him, that they mocked him, that they spit on him, they made the crown of thorns, and they didn't just sit it on his head, they probably pushed it down, which broke the skin. He was probably bleeding from that. That comes a little later here. But the interesting thing before we leave Luke's account is that it says Herod and Pilate, verse 12, became friends with each other that day. You would think Herod would be a little upset with Pilate, trying to palm this problem off on him. Or Pilate mad at Herod that he didn't take care of this because he was the ruler of this region, but rather they became friends. Because it says before that they were enemies with each other. They were Well, they weren't the same. They weren't the same class of status, if you will. Again, Herod was not a Roman, not truly. Um, there is some account that Herod went to school in Roman schools and knew some of the rulers, but one's over the other. And you can imagine some of the friction. But now they had a common problem and a common dislike for the Jews. And there's a friendship that comes out. It's just kind of astounding as that sounds. That was the end result of this. So now Christ is brought back to Pilate a second time. And um, we see more that takes place here because Pilate had a tradition of releasing a criminal around Passover. Now, the Jews, even to this day, speak of Passover in an inclusive sense. It is the event of Passover, and it is the week of unleavened bread. They collectively call that Passover, just like in the fall, they call Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the eighth day, what we now call, or last great day because of John's writings, they call that week, the 8 days, the feast as well. So this feast, Mark 16, verse 6 there, it says, now at the feast he used to release to them one prisoner whom they asked. This was sort of his tradition to show his magnanimous nature. He's willing to work with them and all of this. But it became a common known thing. And so he approaches them, probably thinking, well, now that he has shown them Christ isn't worthy of being crucified, they'll ask for Christ. Well, they twist the tables on him. Verse 7, there was one called Barabbas, bound with his fellow insurgents, men who in the insurrection had committed murder. So these men truly are here for two charges. One is sedition. They were traitors. They were trying to foment a rebellion. But in that rebellion, they ended up killing others. So now they're there for murder as well, what we call premeditated murder. And so the multitude, verse 8, cried aloud and began to ask Pilate to do as he had already always done for them. Not yet clear, but we'll see what they're going to ask. Now, before we leave this, the name Barabbas is an interesting name. We only have record of him here in Mark's account. John and Luke will come back to his name, and he's referenced later as well in Acts 3, not by name, but by action. But the name Barabbas can either be translated from the Aramaic as son of the father or son of the master, and master in the term of teacher, as some called Christ. So he committed murder here during this insurrection. We'll find out from John's account later. He was also a robber, a thief. So this is a guy that doesn't have a very good track record. He's been in trouble, we would say. He's been in trouble with the law regularly. So moving to Luke's account, verse 23, it says, Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, you brought this man to me as one that perverts the people. And behold, having examined him before you, I found no basis for a charge against this man concerning those things which you accuse him. Neither has Herod, for I sent you, and probably looking at Christ, at least the crowd, I sent you to him, and see, nothing worthy of death has been done by him. So both rulers came to the same conclusion. Yeah, the Jews are agitated. Yeah, they're making accusations, but there's no evidence to what they're charging here. And there wasn't. This is a kangaroo court. They rushed this through. They want him dead. We know the prophecies are playing in here. This was all according to plan in terms of Christ being sacrificed in our place. But it was a bum's rush, as we would say. But it shows again the weakness of Herod here, because he's saying here in Luke's account, I have no reason to condemn this man to death, as much as you want to shout at me. And so now they up the ante, if you will. So in Matthew's account, Matthew 27, verse 17, it says, "When they therefore were gathered together, Pilate said, after he told them, I find nothing to charge this man." He asks now about whom to release. And he says, "Do you want Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" Mark's account says he simply asked, "If you want me to release the King of the Jews." We know from John's account here, John 18, verse 39, Pilate acknowledges this custom that he has. And he did this at Passover. He did it in the spring, and he asked if they wanted him to release the King of the Jews. In Luke 23, verse 17, just an interesting note here that in a lot of the Alexandrian manuscripts, this verse is not present. Doesn't really change anything because he'd already made the statement in the other gospel accounts about releasing someone. So just kind of an interesting side note. Going back to Matthew's account, Matthew 27, we have this inset, if you will, this insight that says, "For Pilate knew that because of envy they had delivered Christ to him." So Pilate's not a stupid man. He's just a weak leader. He could see, he's been around the block enough in his questioning, and I'm sure there are many other questions that are not recorded that he asked of Christ, but he could tell this man was innocent, and the Jewish authorities were simply doing this because of envy. They didn't like being upstaged. They didn't like the crowds going to Christ. They didn't like whatever, and Pilate could discern that. Mark records the same thing. Verse 19, "So while he was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife sent him," this is Pilate's wife, "saying, 'Have nothing to do with that righteous man.'" This is Matthew 27, verse 19, if I didn't say. "For I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." So his Pilate's wife goes to him, probably whispered privately, "You don't want to be involved with this. I've not had good dreams about this." Now, it's unclear whether this was a vision from God or just a premonition, as we would say, but it seems that she tried to warn Pilate. And so, verse 20 of Matthew 27, "The chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." So they used their clout and their authority. They probably spread out through the crowd and in sort of a veiled way, probably told them they should ask for Barabbas. So the comparisons are pretty stark. Barabbas is this robber. He's been in and out, we would say, of prison, jail. Now he's involved in this failed insurrection. They ended up killing people. And you've got Jesus Christ, who healed people and cast out demons. And even though they didn't like what he taught from the scriptures, by all accounts, they're not even the same category of men, are they? Mark's account in Mark 15, verse 11, says they stirred up the multitude. They didn't just persuade them, they stirred them up. And remember, they had great authority. They could deny someone entrance to the temple courtyard. They wouldn't be able to come and offer sacrifices. They wouldn't be able to come and participate in other ways. They would be banished, essentially. They would be pariah, is a word that we use at times. We find this later with those that started to respond to the gospel message and they were cast out. This became the setting in Acts 7 where the apostles realized they needed to appoint men, we call deacons, to take care of things because so many widows and others that had no means came to the church and they needed to be taken care of. Normally the temple taxes and the temple offerings would go to take care of some of those things, but they stir them up here. I mean, they're pressing forward on this agenda. They don't want Christ off the hot seat for any reason. And so if they've got to choose, they're telling the people, you better choose Barabbas. So then continuing on, and we'll pick up in John's account, it says, then they all shouted, saying to Pilate, not this man, probably pointing to Christ, but Barabbas. And here John tells us that Barabbas was a robber. In Luke's account, Luke 23, verse 19, we're told directly that he was in prison for murder. So again, not that we judge Barabbas, but he had reasons to be in jail where Christ had no reason to be. And so John 19, verse 1, it says, Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him. Now, again, he's not condemned him. He just got done saying, I find no reason to punish him. So why would he flog him? Well, we'll come back to that. Hold on to that thought for a minute here. So he sends Christ to be flogged. Verse 2 of John 19, the soldiers twisted thorns into a crown. These are briars, and they're probably pretty long thorns, a couple of inches, and they're pretty stiff, and they would have hurt quite a bit. And the skin on the skull, especially towards the top of the head, is very thin, obviously. And if you cut that, because the blood vessels are right there under the skin, it will look awful from the bleeding. And so as they press this crown down, piercing the scalp, the blood starts flowing as well. They saw this as just sport. This is what they did all the time to these prisoners. They dress him in a purple garment, and purple was a very expensive fabric. The shellfish that's in the Mediterranean, when they discovered when they crushed this, it created a purple dye. It was very expensive. So they are mocking him, as the Jews say, he claims to be king. John 19, verse 3, verse 3. So they kept saying, this is the soldiers, Hail, King of the Jews. And they kept slapping him. And this is probably not just, light taps with the open hand. It's probably with some force behind it. These are soldiers. They're not going to coddle somebody. Any anger, frustration, or even if they just enjoy it, they're going to go to full tilt. So John 19, verse 4, Pilate went out again and said to them, so he goes out to the crowd, and he says, behold, I bring him out to you that you may know that I find no basis for a charge against him. So I asked, as we read verse 1 of chapter 19, why would Pilate send Christ to be flogged? And it seems here that maybe what he was trying to do was to show, okay, I've beaten him to within an inch of his life, because this flogging, I'll come back to that in a moment as well. This flogging was pretty serious. Christ is very bloody at this point, and skin is probably ripped open. He's starting to look pretty mangled. And so if he brings Christ out after having gone through this flogging, he can say, look, I told you, I find no charge for death here, but I flogged him. You can see that I pushed it pretty hard. That should be sufficient, but it wasn't sufficient. Because then we have here in all the gospel accounts that the crowd, the Jewish leadership, then all said the same thing. Pilate asked them, what do you want me to do? What should I do to this man you call Christ? Luke's account, Luke 23, verse 20 here tells us that Pilate said these things, again, because he wanted to release Jesus. And this shows the weakness of Pilate as a leader. He is the Roman governor. He could have simply said, look, I'm done with this. I see that this is because of your own personal vendetta. I'm not going to be your agent of punishment, of death here. This man is innocent. I'm going to release him. If he had said that, the Jews probably would have gotten very angry. They might have even rioted. But it would have been the end of the matter concerning Christ. So he's trying to show them here, but he's not pulling the trigger, if you will, to shut them down. So going back to John's account, John 19, verse 5, Jesus therefore came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple garment, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. Look at how he's been flogged. Look at how much he's bleeding. Look at how weak he's already become. Because this matter of flogging or scourging was not this soft event. I don't know how else to say it. It was pretty brutal. There are differing opinions as to what these um, flogging whips looked like, the scourging whips looked like, because they were mostly made with organic matter. It was leather straps. Well, let me just scroll down here. You could see some examples of this. It was leather straps that usually had a wooden handle. The leather would have been attached to the top of the handle, and then on these leather straps, and it varies. Some say 3, some say 9, some say, they don't account for the numbers, however many of these straps, but they all agree that on these straps there would be sharp things and blunt things. The sharp things would be pieces of bone or pieces of metal. Um, that was designed that when the whip went around, you can imagine the centrifugal force of a whip, and as it hit the flesh, they would pull back. And so it would either tear flesh out or it would split it open. There could also be lead balls, kind of think like sinkers on a fish line, where the leather strap would go through the lead and it would be knotted on either side to hold it in place. But that's the blunt trauma. Lead is heavy, even if it's a soft metal, it's still heavy, and this would bruise deep tissue. And so you've got internal bleeding, even if it's not external bleeding. So again, the illustrations vary on this. The historians differ on an opinion of what they looked like because most of these, well, almost all of them, disintegrated over time because they would simply disintegrate because they're organic matter, leather and bone and so forth. But this was a very punishing thing because it was to be part of the process of crucifixion. It was to, and the Roman soldiers were very good at this. It was to bring somebody close to death without killing them. And it was also designed because of its public nature and because of the blood, because of the trauma in the body, it was also designed to be very humiliating. It was to be a statement. This is what happens to people who are worthy of death, whether it's murder, whether it's insurrection, whether it's sedition. This is what will happen. And the Romans did these things very publicly because they wanted to make an example of people. So Christ is very bloody at this point, already starting to be weakened because of the loss of blood. He hasn't eaten in probably close to 12 hours or more, probably hasn't had much to drink. So his body is already beginning to be very compromised. So we go back to verse 7 of John 19. Pilate said, This man has not done anything wrong. He restates in verse 6, take him. If you think this is somebody that you need to punish, then you take him and crucify him yourself. For I find no basis. He makes that statement again. But the Jews answer in verse 7, saying, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die. This is the first time they admit what they truly are angry about. And the anger is, as they say here, because he made himself the Son of God. This is blasphemy. Now, in the Old Testament, that was worthy of death. But again, the Jews are not allowed by the Romans to exercise capital punishment. So they say, we can't kill him, but this is why he needs to die. And then verse 8 is very interesting. It says, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid. So it's probably perhaps that Pilate now sees how deep a religious issue this is. It's not a casual thing. They are very angry about it. But also the reality, what if Christ is indeed the Son of God? Now, even though Pilate didn't go out, as I mentioned earlier, the stories circulated. The number of healings and the dramatic healings. The times the Jews were upset because he healed on the Sabbath or did things they thought were inappropriate according to their law, eating on the Sabbath and all these different things. So the casting out of demons and just everything that Christ did over the 3.5 years of his ministry, it made news around Judea. He was well known. But Pilate never probably put together that the Jews were really upset because they said Christ is claiming to be the Son of God. That part probably never trickled back to Pilate. If it did, he didn't care. But this now catches him because he has repeated several times, I find no basis to put him to death. But what if he is the Son of God? So that would be a fearful thing. So Pilate's thrown off. So he goes back to Christ. Christ is still in the praetorium. The Jews can't go in there. So he'd gone out to say this to the Jews. He goes back into praetorium where Christ is standing now, bloody and beaten, literally. And so then he asks Christ, "Where are you from?" Now, earlier they said from Galilee down to this area. Pilate's not asking here like we ask, "Where are you from?" "Oh, I was born in Michigan. I was born in Ohio. I was born here in Wisconsin," whatever. Then he's not asking that. He's following up on the charge they made here that he claims to be the Son of God. So he says, "Where do you come from?" Christ didn't give him an answer. This is the prophecy in Isaiah 53 that he didn't speak back. He didn't respond. This probably agitated Pilate, but also probably concerned him. He's got a dilemma now, a bigger dilemma than he thought previously. He thought this was just a personal agenda from the Sanhedrin, some difference of opinion over something that Pilate didn't care about. But now this is pretty serious. So Pilate then says, in response, he says to Christ, "Aren't you speaking to me? Why aren't you speaking to me? Don't you know that I have the power to release you and I have the power to crucify you? You better answer me. I could change the whole thing here." And in this case, Christ does respond. And to leave it as a cliffhanger, we'll stop there for tonight. Because there's still more discussion in this matter. Pilate and Christ are not done having a conversation, but at the end of it, Christ is delivered to be crucified. So we'll pick up in John 18, verse 11 next time.